All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're continuing our year in position by position reviews, talking about the linebacker position and what big changes might be in store for the Atlanta Falcons this offseason.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter, at FalcFans, putting up weekly content at the Falcoholic, the SB Nation website for the Atlanta Falcons, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is brought to you by the free GetUpside app. Just download GetUpside and use the promo code Touchdown to get 25 cents back per gallon or more in terms of cash back on your first tank. So, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course, now on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a thumbs up when you do. So today's episode, of course, we're going to be continuing our year in positional reviews. We've done all the offense. We started with the D-line and the edge rushers. Today we're getting into that back seven, getting into the linebacker group. So we'll be talking quite a bit about Dion Jones, Foye Oluokun, Mykal Walker, and potential changes that we could see this offseason where one or more of these guys that we'll be talking about on today's episode may not be back with the Falcons in 2022. So to kick that off, we're going to talk about Dion Jones. It feels like he's the most polarizing of this group. It feels like one of the bigger storylines a lot of people have focused on, particularly towards the back half of the season, was the dip in play from Debo. And I've previously compared it to the dip in play from Michael Boley that we saw in 2008 after several years where Michael Boley was one of the team's top defensive playmakers on those defenses. But then upon the arrival of Mike Smith and his coaching staff in 2008, you just saw a dip in play from Boley. You saw some questionable effort, and eventually he started losing snaps to special teamer Coy Wire. Shout out to Coy Wire. And Boley would eventually depart after that 2008 season, signed a lucrative contract with the New York Giants, spent several productive years there in New York, won a Super Bowl with that Giants team. So, it seemed to work out for Boley. I recall he had some issues with his daughter who was going through some serious medical treatment at the time. I can't remember the specifics of it. And I imagine, there were multiple coaching staff changes that he had from 2006 to 2008. Probably led to potentially less buy-in from him for the third coaching staff, which happened to be the Mike Smith regime. And, again, that's speculation on my part, but it looked similar to maybe what we saw from Dion Jones this past season, where a lot of times it seemed like he was just kind of going through the motions. Now, if you've listened to this podcast pretty consistently over the last, 4 seasons, really going back to the 2017 season, you've heard me frequently be critical of Dion Jones, particularly his run fits, his tackling, all issues that once again reared their ugly head this season, although I'm sure many people would argue, and I wouldn't really argue against it, that those issues were turned up to 11 this past season. And this has been an ongoing saga, I guess you could say, with Dion Jones, where you've heard me talk a lot about the inconsistency that Dion Jones has out there. But it always seemed to be balanced out with the really positive and quote unquote special plays that he could make, where he was showcasing that speed and that range to make plays sideline to sideline, and then really doing an outstanding job locking guys down in coverage. And I always spoke when I was critical of Dion Jones in previous episodes of the podcast, always talked about that balance between the thing where you could get away with the inconsistency snap to snap if they were outweighed by the special plays. And for the most part, in Dion Jones's first 4 years in the NFL, it seemed like that balance was tilted in the direction of the the standout plays And so you could live with the inconsistency and the lack of physicality. But I thought last year in 2020 was the first time we kind of saw that balance get a little bit out of whack and go veer more towards the negative. And then I feel like even though he did have some positive moments in 2021, you saw that balance even more out of whack this season, and more of his positive plays overshadowed by the negative ones. And so, for me, at least when I look at it, where again, like the run fits and the tackling has always been an issue. Maybe they were a bigger issue this year than they have been in previous years, but again, it was always balanced out by those special plays, particularly when it came to Dion Jones and coverage. And I started charting the Falcons' coverages way back in 2019, oh, so long ago. Feels like a lifetime ago. And I remember that season really stood out, how incredible, at least from a charting standpoint, that Dion Jones was in coverage when it came to quote unquote erasing running backs. In that 2019 season, I charted Dion Jones having 26 pass attempts against him when he was in man coverage against the running back, and quarterbacks only completed 38% of those passes, and they were averaging about 1.5 yards per attempt and had a success rate of 15%. And that coverage level is basically elite. And it took a little bit of a step back in 2020, but he still was very, for the most part, effective against running backs. A 63% completion rate, 3.8 yards per attempt, and a 38% success rate covering running backs and man coverage in 2020. But this year, you saw the numbers go, in the wrong direction, continue to go in that wrong direction, with 80% completion rate, 7.9 yards per attempt, and a 50% success rate. And I do think some of that dip in performance for Dion Jones was scheme related. Obviously, he made the move in previous years where he was playing that middle or Mike linebacker role, and made the switch to the weak side or will linebacker role this season, which is a move that people like myself and others have been, speculating about and calling for a number of years. But in the DP scheme, he was asked to be a little bit more of that sort of downhill run defender. And his run fits, I think, mattered a little bit more because the Falcons played a little bit more, or put a little bit less, I'm sorry, of that penetrating attacking front that they typically did in the past. And so he could, he had to basically do his job and fit the run a lot more, because the Falcons were, sort of trying to hold the point of attack rather than attack uphill and let him kind of flow to the football. And so, similar to what Jeff Schultz on the podcast said last week, where he talked about Dion Jones still being a good player, I still believe that Dion Jones is a good player, but he probably needs to go back to a scheme that is more in the style of what the Falcons had from 2016 to 2019, especially, where it was much more of a cover one, cover three based defense. And we saw him play at a really high level for the most part in those first 4 years. And obviously, we'll continue to talk about Dion Jones's future on today's episode. I think he still has a good future ahead of him. He's still fairly young. He's still capable of being an impact linebacker, but it's probably not going to be in Atlanta, because I think, the lack of consistency, the lack of discipline, all things that I was hoping would improve with Dion Jones this season under Dean Pease with his sort of do your job mantra, didn't necessarily improve. And so therefore, I feel like the Falcons are sort of at their end and trying to salvage this situation with Dion Jones, and given his high salary, over $20 million in terms of his cap hit in 2022, it's probably time for the Falcons to move on. But we'll get a little bit more into that as we continue today's episode. And, we'll talk a little bit more about Foye Oluokun, his 2021 season and his future, as well as Mykal Walker's, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But again, I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. And as usual, I have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And that today is, of course, the Locked On Hawks podcast, where host Brad Rowland's giving you the lowdown on all things Atlanta Hawks on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So it's a new year, and that's, means New Year's resolutions. But now that we're in February, a lot of people have already given up on their New Year's resolution. I can say for myself, I've given up on my New Year's resolution. And it wasn't necessarily eating healthier, although I probably should have made it my New Year's resolution this year, but it was something else. And, if yours was eating healthier and you've already given up on it, you probably could have done a better job if you had made Built Bar part of your plan, because Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, even better than a candy bar. Eating healthy can be hard, but Built Bars make it easier to stick to that healthy eating plan because Built Bars taste so good. You want to eat it because Built Bars are good for you. They're low in sugar, low in calories, low in carbs, high in protein, high in fiber. And there's so many flavors to choose from. You can mix up that variety because I know when you're on those diets, you get a little bit tired of eating the same old boring stuff every day, but Built Bar come in a variety of flavors like coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, cookies and cream, salted caramel. They get new, limited time flavors all the time, every other week or so. And you can find white chocolate cookies and cream now, coconut marshmallow puff, eggnog, and much, much more by heading over to built.com. And when you do, use the promo code LOCK15 and you'll get 15% off your order. Again, that's promo code LOCKed15 for 15% off at built.com. So, guys, let's talk about Foye Oluokun's season. And hopefully I will get his name right enough on this podcast so that one listener in particular doesn't send me that angry email telling me how I already botched it. I probably already botched it already today. So I will try to get it right from here on out and say Oluokun. It's just so easy to say Oluokun. And that one doesn't count. That doesn't count. So I think Oluokun's season was, I'll just say Foye. I think he had a decent year. I don't think he was great this year, but I think he stepped up, particularly in the second half of the season. His coverage numbers for my charting bear that out. Before the bye week, he was allowing a success rate of 76% in coverage. And after the bye week, it was 54%. Now, 54% is by no means great in terms of coverage ability, but it did show that he seemed to get a little bit more comfortable playing within the defense. The big knock on Oluokun this season is the amount of big plays that he allowed. My charting had the Falcons giving up 39 20-plus yard plays this year in zone coverage alone. And Oluokun was given responsibility for a team-high 9 of those 39 plays, with 7 of them coming while the Falcons were playing their sort of cover 2 defense. And you heard me throughout the season talk about how the Falcons really struggled to play cover 2. And a lot of that is due to, the vulnerabilities inherent to the cover 2 often lead to the ball being funneled over the middle, down the seams and whatnot. And you look at a lot of the big plays that the Falcons gave up with their cover 2, came at the expense of the linebackers and the safeties. And all of that isn't necessarily due to, guys playing poorly. It's just, again, the vulnerabilities that cover 2 defense does allow teams to sort of attack down the middle of the field. Those are vulnerabilities that you're going to see get exploited. And unfortunately for Foye, he was on the wrong side of that exploitation far too often. But I do think he did show growth over the course of the season, and it makes me feel better that he will be improved should he return to Atlanta in 2022. And we will see that be less of an issue in 2022 than it was in 2021. So I think the arrow is pointing up for Foye Oluokun in this scheme. But the question is going to be, will he return to Atlanta in 2022? Because, of course, he is an unrestricted free agent. But I do think he's a player that the Falcons would like to have back, because I do think, in contrast to Dion Jones, and it's not always fair to compare these two and pit these two guys against each other, but I do think Foye does check a lot of the boxes, or a lot more of the boxes, that Dean Pease looks for in his linebacker. He does seem to fit more of that do your job mantra. He's more consistent with his run fits. That's one of the reasons why the Falcons moved him to middle linebacker, so that he can be a little bit more of a downhill player and deal with some of the trash that, the middle linebacker is more prone to see in the Pease scheme. I think he's a more capable blitzer just because of that same physicality that he has. A lot of Dion Jones's pressure, Dion Jones's ability to get from point A to point B is as fast as any human being, at least in the city of Atlanta. And that allows that when you scheme up pressure for him, and you get him a free rush at the quarterback, he's going to close quickly and make a lot of plays. But when those times where it's not schemed up and he has to beat a blocker, that running back in particular, that's going to step up and pick up that blitz through the A gap or B gap or whatever the case may be, Dion Jones doesn't win in those situations as frequently, because he, again, not necessarily being that super physical guy that's going to blow up the running back and run through him and still get pressure on the quarterback. Oluokun is a little bit more of that player. Again, I wouldn't sit here and say that that's his strength. He's no like Devin White or anything like that, or anybody that's going to just blow through a running back consistently. But he's more capable of doing that type of stuff and winning those blocks. And I think Oluokun is also a much better tackler, and that was certainly evident in the 2021 season. So I think the Falcons definitely want to have him back. And we'll talk about, whether or not they'll be able to get him back later in the episode. But let's talk a little bit briefly about the other linebacker in the group, the guy that was often a forgotten man, which is Mykal Walker. And he does look like a possible in-house replacement, particularly for Dion Jones, since the majority of his snaps seem to come as a will or weak side linebacker this year. I know a lot of people were upset that Mykal Walker didn't get a lot more opportunities this past year, particularly as an edge rusher. I never really bought into that whole notion, though, because I just never saw Walker, whether we talk about his days at Fresno State or last year in Atlanta, as anybody that was bringing a whole lot to the table as a pass rusher. Without, as we talked about with the edge rush group, it wasn't like the guys that we had there were bringing a whole lot, but at least those guys were guys that specialize in being pass rushers and taking a 230, 240 pound linebacker that has very limited career production as a pass rusher, and thinking that he was going to be better than guys that had spent 5, 6, 8, 10 years rushing the quarterback. Just didn't make a ton of sense to me. But when it comes to Mykal Walker as an off-ball blitzer, I do think he does have that potential to be maybe an upgrade over Dion Jones if he's blitzing from the inside or off-ball linebacker position, because again, he probably brings a lot more physicality as a downhill blitzer than Jones does, and maybe, as I just mentioned, capable of winning those one-on-one blocks when the running back is sort of between him and the quarterback. I think Walker has more of that ability than Dion Jones does, although again, this year he didn't necessarily show that, but again, there was limited opportunities. Now, where Walker did stand out this year was in coverage. That was primarily his usage this year. You would often see Pease sort of bring in all three linebackers in passing down situations, and he would sort of simulate pressure by having those guys line up on the line of scrimmage, several of those guys lining up in the A gaps, and then would have, bring one or two of those guys and often have Walker dropping into coverage fairly consistently. And I think the pick six he had in the second Carolina game was a good example of him being utilized in that same way on a similar play, where he was able to drop into the throwing lane after sort of simulating that pressure at the line of scrimmage and pick off Cam Newton and take it to the house. And I think the thing that Walker also has in the event that he does wind up replacing Dion Jones is he's a lot more physical at the point of attack as a run defender, and has a little bit more of that downhill run defense mentality that Dion Jones was lacking in this past year. Although there are concerns about Mykal Walker in terms of missed tackles. I had both him and Jones charted with 4 missed tackles when they were the primary defender in coverage this year. So, at face value, you say, oh, okay, well, they missed the same amount of tackles. But you got to remember, Jones had a lot more opportunities. Based off my charting, Jones had 85 snaps where he was the primary defender in coverage and only missed 4 of those tackles. And Walker had 15 snaps and missed the same amount of tackles. So, I think that's going to be something that Walker is going to have to improve upon, being able to be a more reliable tackler in the open field. Because based off of the limited sample size he had this year, he was worse than Dion Jones was. I think in terms of his overall coverage ability, though, I for the most part, from based off my charting, he's done a pretty solid job the last 2 seasons. Although again, the sample size isn't massive, and one does wonder in the event where he winds up being a starter next year with an increase in sample size, will that hold up nearly as effectively as it did on the smaller sample? But I do think, while I don't know if his ceiling in terms of coverage is as high as Jones was to be sort of the same caliber of player that we saw Dion Jones in, say, in 2019, when he was locking down Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey. I think across like 2 games against those 2 guys, I think he gave up 0 completions on like 8 targets or something like that against those 2 guys. I don't expect Mykal Walker to be that type of dude, but I certainly think in terms of if what we've seen from Dion Jones these last couple of years, Mykal Walker does have at least a floor where it's realistic that he could exceed what Dion Jones has been the last couple of years. Again, I don't think he has that super high ceiling that we saw at peak Dion Jones, but potentially the floor is a little bit higher because again, some of these things in terms of run fits and coverage ability, or close enough, or if not better than Dion Jones, that he could be a little bit more consistent player than what we've gotten from Jones the last couple of years. And so, it'll be interesting to see what Walker does if he does get an expanded role this upcoming season, because I remember when we drafted him and I was giving my scouting report, I wasn't necessarily super high on Mykal Walker. And one of the things I recall saying about him was that he's the type of player that, in say year 3 or year 4, which are the next 2 years would be of his rookie contract, could wind up being a functional starter for you, but mostly because you don't have better options. Not because you thought he specifically was a great option in that regard. And that may be the situation the Falcons find themselves. Now, the caveat of me saying that was when I said that back in like May of 2020, and I think I compared that to Foye Oluokun and saying like that's what Oluokun was going to be, which was a halfway decent starter for you that upcoming season. But obviously, I think Oluokun wound up exceeding those expectations and became much better than a halfway decent starter. And actually, at times, again, not consistently week to week, but at times has been a very good starter for the Falcons these last 2 seasons. And so, while part of me is skeptical that Mykal Walker may be the solution in terms of long term solution at the inside linebacker position, I do feel at the very least he should be a stopgap. And I wonder, could we get a better version of him than what I initially thought he would be 2 years ago? Because I think he has exceeded my expectations so far in the league based off of that. And so while you're not going to hear me, sit here this offseason and be like, oh, yeah, I'm really high on Mykal Walker. He's going to be one of these breakout players or whatever the case may be. He may wind up being like probably later in the offseason, we'll do some potential breakout players for 2022. And he might wind up being that guy by default, but not necessarily because I'm like, oh, he's going to blossom as a starter with an expanded role in 2022. So I say that because I'm not necessarily completely sold on him having that type of potential, but at the same time, I'm not like completely out on the notion that he could wind up continuing to exceed my expectations and his contributions this upcoming season in his third and potentially later down the road in his fourth year may wind up exceeding those expectations. And he may wind up, being similar to what we've seen now with Foye Oluokun as a player that, went from just sort of being a stopgap starter for us 2 years ago to a guy that we're trying to lock into a long-term second contract. And there's certainly a chance that Mykal Walker could be that guy. And so we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. And, talking about locking Foye Oluokun into a second contract, that's going to be a big question mark heading into this offseason. And we'll get into what potentially could be other offseason moves that the Falcons make at this linebacker group, including whether or not they trade Dion Jones, whether or not they sign other linebackers, or whether or not they could be in the mix to draft a linebacker at the top of this 2022 draft. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons episode. But guys, before we get there, I want to let you know that it is Super Bowl week, brought to you by GetUpside, and no better place to get the big game coverage than on the Locked On Podcast Network. Locked On Bengals and Locked On Rams are going to be in LA all week long covering the big game. And of course, you can find all those shows available on the same podcast platforms that you currently are listening to or watching Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. Now, I don't know if Locked On Bengals or Locked On Rams drove or Locked On Rams probably didn't drive that far to head to LA to cover the game, but Locked On Bengals with Jake and James, I don't know if they drove. They probably flew. But if you're looking to travel, and, Locked On Rams, that LA traffic can be tough, and, they're stuck in the car and you wind up burning through a ton of gas. So if you're traveling to LA or elsewhere, you're looking for ways of saving at the pump. And of course, now you can with a new app called GetUpside, where you get cash back with every gallon of gas that you put in your car. There's no catch. It's all free. You can download the GetUpside app for free in the App Store or on Google Play. All you got to do is open the app, go to one of the thousands of eligible gas stations near you. You fill up, you claim their offer, and they put money directly into your bank account, and then you can cash out anytime you like with direct payments into your bank account. You can use PayPal. I like to get mine on Amazon gift cards. And now when you open an account on GetUpside and use our special promo code touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free GetUpside app and use the promo code touchdown when you sign up. That's GetUpside, promo code touchdown to start saving every time you fill up. So let's talk about some of the impending free agents. Foye Oluokun is an impending unrestricted free agent. Darren Bates is also an impending unrestricted free agent. We talked about Brandon Copeland when we talked about the edge rush group. He is also a free agent, but initially when Brandon Copeland was signed, the expectation was that he was going to play more of an inside off-ball linebacker role for the Falcons in 2021, but wound up being kicked out to edge after, the Barkevious Mingo situation of the summer. But Copeland is also headed to free agency and thus could be in the mix for a depth role here at the inside linebacker position next year. Emanuel Ellerbe, I believe on overthecap.com, is listed as an unrestricted free agent, but I think technically he is a restricted free agent. I will double check with that, but I'm pretty sure I looked it up and he's a restricted free agent. You also have, in addition to Mykal Walker under contract, you have Dorian Etheridge and Rashad Smith under contract as futures contracts that the Falcons picked up from the practice squad earlier this month. So I think when we look at that group of players, Darren Bates certainly could return and be re-signed for a sort of a veteran minimum contract due to his special teams ability. When you look at his career, he's played close to a decade in the NFL. He's had almost 3,000 career snaps on special teams and only like 150 on defense. So Darren Bates knows where his bread is buttered, and that's on special teams where, that phase of the game that really does matter. So I think, in terms of the fourth inside off-ball linebacker, whatever you want to call it, that is active on game day, that's primarily a special teams role. Obviously, Mykal Walker also plays on special teams and, was productive in that role as well. But Bates, Ellerbe, Etheridge, Rashad Smith, any of these guys certainly would be in the competition for that fourth spot that's purely a special team spot that probably won't get a ton of reps on defense unless there are multiple injuries. So I think, you have that spot covered, but you need three other guys active on game day. Obviously, this past year, that was Dion Jones, Foye Oluokun, and Mykal Walker. And the question is going to be, who are those three guys going to be next year? We know Walker is going to be one of those guys because he's under contract. The question is, of course, whether he'll be, one of the two starters or just the backup again and continue to contribute on special teams. I've said several times on the podcast over the last couple of months that I do not expect Dion Jones to be back in Atlanta in 2022. But as I told Jeff Schultz earlier this past week, a lot of that may be dependent on what happens with Foye Oluokun. Re-signing Oluokun, I don't think it's going to be easy. If we're looking at the Falcons' top three impending free agents, or I guess the four most important free agents that they have to resign, because Thomas Morstead is on that list. But, I'll save that for the special teams review. But of the three guys on offense and defense, that would be Foye Oluokun, Russell Gage, and Cordero Patterson at the highest profile guys that are hitting free agency. Looking at those three guys, I feel like Oluokun will probably be the player that I have the least amount of confidence, at least today. Maybe that changes in 6 weeks. But the least confidence in today that is going to be back here in Atlanta. And I mentioned on, I think, Friday's Q&A where, someone asked me what his market could be. And I cited Pro Football Focus projecting him at about $10 million a year. And I feel like that's about where I'm expecting him. I'm hoping it's a little less than that. But I feel like that's a fairly accurate projection based off of where the market has been in recent years. And $10 million a year may be too rich for the Falcons. I think the positive going for the Falcons in this situation with Oluokun is, as I said on Friday, that the linebacker class in this upcoming draft, based off of the current buzz, is considered to be solid. And so you may not see NFL teams as willing to break the bank for free agents in March because they feel confident that they can get good quality, capable starting linebackers well into day 2 of the draft and possibly even day 3 of the draft. But then again, we've seen, some fairly middling linebackers, players that I don't necessarily feel like are better than Foye Oluokun in recent years, in recent off seasons, like Corey Littleton and Blake Martinez and Jerome Baker, all get contracts north of $10 million a year on the open market. And so I think, Foye's agent has every reason to think that he should be able to get his client the same, and we'll sort of see if that happens. And if the Falcons are only willing to offer $8 or $9 million a year, then there's no incentive for Foye and his agent to not want to try to test the market to see if they can get a 10 or 11 or $12 million a year contract. And so, we'll see what happens once we get to that tampering period on March 14th, I believe it is this year. Because if you can't get a deal done during that sort of 2-3 day window, and we get to March 16th when free agency officially kicks off at 4 p.m. Eastern time, the odds typically go down that you can get a guy re-signed after that point. At least when it comes to the guys that are likely to get multi-year contracts. If a guy's going to get like a 1 year sort of minimum deal, then yeah, you can let him test the market or whatever the case may be. But if Oluokun does wind up testing the market and winds up walking, then I do think, going back to what I said to Jeff Schultz, it's going to be a lot harder for the Falcons to be able to move on from Dion Jones and trade him. I think trading Dion Jones would free up about $9.3 million in salary cap space in 2022. And I think I referred to it previously as you're essentially salary dumping him at this point in time. It's, his cap hit next year is over $20 million. While restructuring would be an option, again, they restructured him twice this past year, and that would save you about $6.5 million with a max restructure this year. I feel like that extra $3 or so million in cap space from trading him is definitely worthwhile when we're talking about having the cap space to bring in new guys and or retain some of your current guys. And we'll sort of have to see if the Falcons can figure it out. The good thing going for the Falcons is there isn't as much of a time crunch on Dion Jones' situation as it is with maybe Matt Ryan's situation, because Dion Jones is due a roster bonus on March 21st that will make his cap hit become that $20 million figure. And March 21st is like the 6th day of the new league year. And so if you add in basically the 2 days of legal tampering where the Falcons are allowed, wink, wink, to start talking to teams about trading him, they basically have a week to kind of shop Dion Jones if they need to, and a week to see if they can get Foye Oluokun back in the fold, or potentially get a replacement for Foye Oluokun if he does wind up walking, and still have time to move Dion Jones if need be. And I think the two obvious candidates that you would look at if the Falcons were to sign a linebacker in free agency, whether that's someone to replace Foye Oluokun or someone to potentially replace Dion Jones, you would look at the two Titans linebackers hitting the open market that did play under Dean Pease back in Tennessee with Rashaan Evans and Jayon Brown. I'll be curious what their markets are, because based off of the various projections I've seen on some of these, salary cap websites, it doesn't appear to be robust. They're not necessarily being listed among the top free agents linebackers hitting the market, although they were very productive players a couple of years ago, particularly under Dean Pease in Tennessee. They have not necessarily lived up to those expectations the last couple of years, and both players were essentially benched by the end of the season in favor of guys like Zach Cunningham and David Long in Tennessee. So I don't think there's any chance that they're going to be returning to Tennessee, but maybe other teams will look at them as sort of bargain free agents, and maybe that drives up their market to be a little bit more than current projections seem to indicate. Or maybe they're just willing to go back to a happier time in their lives where they were playing for Dean Pease and being productive. And if that means settling for like, a 1-year prove it contract or whatever the case may be to try to, earn that long-term lucrative contract in the future, maybe that's a place for, Atlanta's a good place for them to come. And, who knows, like we could see both those guys playing for Atlanta in 2022 under certain circumstances if the Falcons decide to move on from both Dion Jones and Foye Oluokun. But at least in terms of those two guys, Evans was more of that will linebacker in Tennessee, so he seems like a little bit more of an obvious replacement for Dion Jones in the same role. Jayon Brown was more of that Mike that called the defense for Tennessee for several years. So you would imagine if Oluokun is the guy that the Falcons wind up losing, they would target Brown instead. So we'll just sort of have to see how that works out. Other potential free agents that have connections to Falcons linebacker coach Frank Bush from his days with the Jets are Harvey Lange, who's now with the Patriots, Neville Hewitt with the Texans, and Patrick Onwuasor with the Raiders. All of those guys are more backup level players and not necessarily viable starters. So I think you would see them signed if the Falcons were to pursue one of those guys. It would probably be with the understanding that Mykal Walker is probably going to be the starter, or there's also a world where the Falcons could, look to find a starter in the draft. And particularly in a world where the Falcons lose one or both Jones and Oluokun, or both of those guys, then all of a sudden I think linebacker becomes a much more feasible option for the Falcons, at least from a need standpoint. We know the Falcons are all about that best player available. We'll see how much they're about that life in this upcoming draft. You can say it as many times as you want, but if you wind up drafting for need, we'll know it when we see it. But linebacker is not a position that gets a lot of love in terms of mock drafts and what the Falcons may do at that 8th overall selection, but it could be, particularly if the Falcons wind up losing one or both Jones or Oluokun this offseason. And you obviously have guys like Nakobe Dean from Georgia, Devin Lloyd from Utah is another player that's being mentioned as a potential top 10 pick. The Falcons, of course, could also find somebody later in the draft, particularly in round 2. Guys like, Georgia. Dean has 2 teammates from Georgia that are expected to be potential second-round picks. Maybe one or more of these guys could wind up sneaking into the back end of round 1, which is Foye Walker and Channing Tindall. You also have Alabama's Christian Harris, who is also in the mix there. There's other players that you're being heard mocked on, like day 2 of the draft. We'll get into those guys at a later date potentially. But I will say, for the record, in terms of my opinion on at least these 5 linebackers that I've mentioned today specifically, I am not as high on Foye Walker and Devin Lloyd as other people are. I think they're both good prospects. But I don't necessarily see Lloyd as a top 10 pick. He's more of a mid to late first round pick. And while I think Walker would be a solid day 2 selection, I kind of like Channing Tindall a lot more than him. And I see Walker more as like a third round guy than necessarily a potential top 50 pick that, he may wind up being. But we'll sort of see how it goes. Obviously, there's a lot of potential for turnover at this position this offseason, where the Falcons could lose one or both starters. I mean, there's certainly a possibility where both of these guys do return. I would be highly skeptical of that, but I won't sit here and tell you that there's a 0% chance of that happening. They could find a way to make it work with both Dion Jones and Foye Oluokun this offseason. So we'll sort of have to see how it goes. And when it comes to the draft, that's just something to keep an eye on. Again, we'll see. You go back to that 2020 draft, where around this time in 2020, in the lead up to the draft, not a whole lot of people were sitting here talking about the Falcons taking a corner around 1. It seemed like a lot of people were focused on the edge rusher, K'Lavon Chaisson, AJ Epinesa at this point in time. And then we saw, as the offseason unfolded, when the Falcons released Desmond Trufant, that cornerback shot to the top of the list as one of the biggest needs on this football team. And we could see a similar circumstance with this linebacker group, where, changes that could happen in March could wind up changing the math on this linebacker need, moving up to the top of the board. And again, I think you can make an argument that Nakobe Dean, at least I wouldn't argue against somebody if someone said Nakobe Dean's one of the 8 to 10 best players in this draft class. And so therefore he could potentially be, the best player available for the Falcons at that 8th overall spot. So we'll just sort of have to see how it all plays out. So I'm sure we'll be talking more about the linebackers as the next, 11-ish weeks unfold between now and the draft. And we'll see how free agency unfolds, in 5 or 6 weeks as we gear up for the draft. So that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons year-end positional review of the Falcons off-ball linebacker positions. We will be talking tomorrow about the corners, and then later in the week we'll be getting to the safeties. I don't think I'll be able to get to special teams until next week after the Super Bowl, but we're almost done with these positional reviews. But if you guys have any feedback that you want to provide me on anything I discussed on today's episode, or anything you want me to discuss on future episodes, or anything I've discussed on past episodes, of course, you can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or, of course, you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. And before you duck out of here with that comment, make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Bets podcast. Make that your second listen. I know Lee Sterling, the handicapping expert, that's giving you those daily picks and those blowout specials and those lock of the days every single day on Locked On Bets. I'm sure he's going to have some great props for you all week long on the Locked On Bets podcast. So go check out Locked On Bets to get you prepared for this Super Bowl, as well as other games going on elsewhere in sports as we, dwindle down to the end of this football season. So Lee's going to have you covered all off season long. So make sure you subscribe to Locked On Bets. So guys, that's it for us on today's Locked On Falcons. I appreciate it. Till then,